So I call myself a child of. Sometimes it's interesting to identify yourself with the Windrush, or for me personally, because I grew up in Bedford I was born in 1969. That's a while ago. And my parents are from Caribbean background. So my dad's Jamaican and my mum's Novetian. And they were part of the 60s phase, so the last phase of migration. In fact, my mum was here a bit earlier, in 58. My dad came in 61, and that's quite significant. It's before the Immigration Act of 1961. But I didn't know all that growing up. What I knew and what I experienced was growing up in a very Caribbean house. But I didn't know what element was my mother's and what element was my dad's. So we were a family that ate fried dumpling. There was pig foot in the soup and pigtail. Did not like that at all. My mum had coconut drops. Music was a huge thing. And eccentricity was, I wouldn't even have called it eccentricity until I left home, but my dad's friends had ridiculous names like Sonny Ram or Puppy Show Squarehead or Rubber Lip GMs. And my mum was not part of the black-led churches, but as I come to understand, a lot of her sense of faith was very much in line with the way in which we thought of faith growing up, that it was imminent, so it was in the house, that the supernatural and the natural were not sort of divisible. So we talked about Duppy a lot, and parents would kind of come up with Duppy stories. Also, other techniques for finding out the truth. So the ring over the water. I'm not sure if everybody will remember the ring over the water, but you would dangle a ring over still water in a cup, and if the water went to one side or went to the other, whatever side it would be a sign that the child was lying. Because normally being used to find out whether or not you were lying, whether you in fact had stolen the last fried dumpling. We grew up in a house where physical chastisement was okay. So yeah, I didn't experience the belt too much, because I think my dad was getting tired by the time that I grew up. My mum wasn't into that, to be honest. I think she had quite a difficult childhood in the Caribbean, so she kind of, growing up in Nevis, so she was very much against that. We had a wide family network and very different energies in that wider family network. So an evangelical Christian, deep within the church family on my dad's side. On my mum's side, Nevis is a very different island, so Pentecostalism never came to Nevis. It was more the traditional churches. So we went to the Moravian, the Church of England, and only lastly did we went to a Baptist church, and then lastly we went to a Pentecostal church. There was 8 of us, and my parents, so a lively house. And I grew up listening to my dad's music. Music was very much part of my dad's culture, his personal, culture and stuff. So was dressing well. He always looked $1 million when he stepped out the house. And as soon as he came home, he put on what we'd call lodging goose. So some things are just family inventions, and so we had this term lodging goose for your home clothes. And it made a lot of sense, because, if you have a big family and, all of us were going through the school system, the last thing you wanted was to be buying school clothes again and again. So as soon as you came home, you take your school clothes off. And there was a thing, actually, that we'd kind of look down on people like, see that boy over the street, wearing him school clothes. As if that you'd sort of like a sign of a dirty stop out. But I think it was more to do with preserving your clothes for longer. So my dad's music was a big thing, and his friends, rum drinking. Mum being religious is quite a distinct culture to that. but also meeting his friends, people from different islands. So I grew up in Bedford. Bedford's very different from Bristol. Bristol being, maybe it's changing now, but mostly Jamaican in terms of where people came from. But Bedford was Carriacou, people from Grenada, Jamaicans, of course, some of the other islands as well, and Nuvitians. So more of a wider mix of different islands. And then we started to develop our own family culture as Black British kids. And each generation's experience is different. You know, my brother went to school, and I think in his years it was more like a war between teachers and black kids. The racism against black kids was quite acute. So some of the things that he described happening weren't things that I experienced. My older brother is going on 60. So even in that time and period, it was a kind of, I think, a learning curve really for teachers and for pupils. You can imagine that for these teachers it would have been perhaps their first experience of multiculturalism, lots of reports and other bits of information telling them that black kids were SEN. And I know it's interesting now, it's become something which filmmakers like Stephen McQueen have started talking about, making films around. But even when we were at school, I experienced some of that kind of second guessing. And some of it was because people didn't understand that, or didn't dignify the way that people from the Caribbean spoke. So in my lifetime, that understanding has undergone a revolution. We talk about Ebonics, the theories of black language and linguistics. How, for example, when you have an African language encountering European language, it creates a new grammatical structure. Sometimes words are preserved. We were told we spoke broken English, and if you spoke broken English, then it was a sign that you were, to use the old language, you were retarded. So it wasn't a case of code, and so of course kids would use it as a kind of defiance to this hostile environment of school and society generally. I would say that by the time I was growing up, I remember a rich multicultural education. We had assemblies for Sikhs, Hindus. Maybe it was actually dividing people up into little pockets. There was something a bit rigid about that, but I think there was an attempt to kind of make sense of where we were from. But nonetheless, it felt very compartmentalized, going home and listening to all the sounds and sights of Caribbean home that weekend, you know, the weddings and parties, the intergenerational fun and joy. And people didn't, I think one of the key things we talk about, the Windrush, which, you know, trying to get a bit deeper into that, there wasn't this understanding that people just suddenly get older and stop doing things anymore, like stop going out or stop dancing. I always remember that the oldest people at the weddings were the first and the last to leave the dance floor. I always remember that this pride in how you were and how you dressed was maintained throughout life. You know, to your grave you were a person, a character, alive. And also, you know, having swag. But sensuality, you know, older people doing the whiny and jumping on the dance floor singing whiny pum pum. And it wasn't this thing that, you know, oh, you get to a certain age, you know, you have to put things in, I don't go club anymore because, you know, I'm like getting old now. I feel that some of that's been lost, you know. I remember growing up and, you know, as I got older and you start going clubbing, and the last people to dance were all the black people who knew how to dance really well. But there was just this kind of reserve about shame or embarrassment or not being a puppy show. I don't know. So, yeah, there was a real strong sense of the division between this school life and, of course, when you're moving away from school, and this home life where I spoke differently. I listened to different music. And it was deeper than that. There was almost a different persona. Social rules around protecting people. You knew how far to go with your ribbing and your joking. You also, a strong sense of secrecy, or secrecy maybe it's the wrong word, but people's business was their business. And it's interesting because on the one hand, and I've seen English white friends, get this wrong, where there's an understanding that the culture that I grew up in, we inherited, was so open that everything was up for discussion. But actually I grew up with lots of family secrets, lots of issues around people's private business, things that should and shouldn't be said, and that they were unwritten rules, and you just kind of knew. So it might seem as if everyone was free and prolificant, but actually you kind of had to know what would expose people, what would embarrass them, what was not your thing to say. Funerals as well. Just these big high occasions of life where you actually got to see the difference of expressiveness. It wasn't a case of kind of holding it in as a noble thing, but people fully embodying grief, and the open casket, and then food and joy. In New Orleans they have the ritual with the trumpets and people walking the street. It was never as expressively ritualized in that sense of walking down the street, with a kind of ritual procession. But actually, in my recollection, that energy was quite similar. You would bawl, and then you would eat food, and then afterwards somebody would fling on some good tunes, and then you'd pour out some liquor for the dead person, and before you knew it, you was flinging foot, It was just, again, one of those things that I missed, but intergenerationalness of it, which brought people together. It was opportunities, because I think, black families were often scattered, you had relatives in Birmingham, you had people in Leeds, people in London. Sometimes families came to England and lost touch. My dad, I didn't know my uncles until a wedding. And I thought, meet your uncle. I'm like, what uncle? And it was the first time I ever met this uncle. It was an interesting thing with thinking through about migration, because, it's a two-edged sword. On the one hand, a lot of not so much my father, because my dad didn't have a great education, and my mum chose to raise us as her main occupation. But for some people, it was a drop in their lifestyle, in their income and possibilities. But on the other hand, they earned perhaps more, especially at a point where you could buy homes, secure a legacy, that they might have struggled to do if they weren't the middle classes in Jamaica. So complex. But he also left kids behind, and I've got family, siblings that my dad did manage to send for. And I think other people have similar stories. So migration breaks families up. And I guess at the time, I used to think some of this was peculiarly West Indian, and I think, why are we so dysfunctional? And then you're older and you start reading academic stuff, and you realise that actually this has happened throughout the world, where men and women migrate for work purposes. Families don't always come back together. Sometimes people stay in that city, country, place where they've migrated to for a better living. And the remittances are a way of kind of like aid, really, for the people that moved on. But speaking of that, there was, I guess, for me, a visceralness that I often don't see captured. There's a lot of the joy and the fun, but I also saw women struggling, in particular, mum struggling to keep house and home together. You have a really complex community, you know, of rum drinking, blues dancing, older men who might, my dad's generation, and a lot of the money might disappear at the week in a dominoes match or in gambling. And mum had to make ends meet with the kids. Sometimes I saw quite a brutal gender relationship, you know, with, we talk about patriarchy, I didn't have those words when I was growing up, but quite brutal attitudes to women, treatment of women. Some of that, you know, I come to think has come out of slavery and how that's created attitudes that have persisted. These weren't uniform by any means. There was a complex community, different people living on different kind of lives and lifestyles, you know. But it is something which I think sometimes gets kind of missed out on the way that we talk about Windrush and Windrush stories. So it's, if I was to talk about, you know, what Windrush means to me or what it's done to England, it's hard to not, in a sense, think about how profound that is. And I mean that when I watch not the black English players, but as an example, white English sportsmen and so on, who've got swag, who inhabit their masculinity in a different way from what I remember. And some of that is that black masculinity and femininity has changed British identity in quite fundamental ways. And we talk about food and we talk about drink and so on. But if we think of imperialism as a sort of military and economic force, then I would say that our agency and how it's changed Britain has been cultural. It might be seen as a soft power, and it's not a power that we've managed to actualize. But it's a profound thing when white Britons have as their ideals, or even move and talk in ways that are reflective of idioms and personalities and styles that have come from the Caribbean. So we wouldn't have Britain today in its form, divided and confused as it is, without the Windrush.